We're looking at selecting next, a very important part of Photoshop, because you cannot do much in the way of editing without being able to select things effectively. So I'm going to open up a file, the Surfer Girl, which you can download, and let's just have a look at some of the ways of selecting. So Photoshop has a lot of selection tools. We're not going to cover them all here, but starting from the very basic kinds of selections to more sophisticated selections. So the selection tools are over here on the left-hand side, and you can see that they start with your marquee selection tool. So rectangular marquee, elliptical marquee. A marquee is basically, when you look at the old-fashioned movie houses with the trains of lights going around the title of the movie or the theater production, that's a marquee. So when you create a marquee, if I just use rectangular marquee and I drag out, you'll see that it's kind of like those lights going around the edge. We also call those the marching ants. That's a sort of slang term for them. So a rectangular marquee is just a rectangular selection, and while I stay on a selection tool, I can drag that around. I could even right click and say transform selection, and I can adjust that selection to something different. As soon as I switch to my move tool and I drag, I am now moving the pixels that I selected. So I'm just going to undo that. To deselect is Control D or Command D. When you are using a selection tool, you'll see that you have these four modes up here: new selection, add to selection, subtract from selection, and intersect with selection. So they do exactly what you would expect them to do. So with new selection active, whenever I drag a new selection, the old selection disappears and the new one becomes the selection. If I choose add to selection, then the old selections stay and I'm simply adding to the existing selection. And subtract would be what you would imagine. It subtracts from your selection. And then intersect is wherever the new selection and the old selection overlap, that becomes the new selection. Less used than add and subtract. There are shortcuts for these, but I'm not going to discuss those at the moment because they can be confusing, because the Shift and Alt keys can be used for other things as well. So rather use these four modes at the moment, and then you can use your shortcuts as you get more familiar with them. So I'm going to deselect. So that's your rectangular marquee. You also have this feather value up here. So feathering is softening the edges. So if I make a selection without feathering, and then I add to that selection and put in a 20 pixel feather, and then I take my move tool and I move them, can you see the difference? The one that had the feather on it is softer around the edges. So feathering is basically softening the edge of the selection. I'm going to undo that and deselect. Always remember to set your feather value back down to 0 afterwards. So your rectangular marquee tool makes rectangles. All the rules that you have learnt in other programs like Illustrator apply here. Shift to make a perfect square, Alt to draw from the center out. Okay, and here's where it gets tricky. If I hold down Alt first and then start drawing, I'm subtracting. If I start drawing and then hold down Alt afterwards, I'm drawing from the center out. It can be a little bit confusing. And same with Shift. If I hold Shift first and drag, I'm adding to my selection. If I start dragging and then hold Shift afterwards, I'm now constraining this to a square. Okay, deselect. My elliptical marquee tool is the same as the rectangular marquee, except it makes ellipses. So Shift to make a perfect circle or make an ellipse. All the other tools still apply here. I'm going to deselect. These two ones, single row marquee and single column marquee, I'm not going to cover. I personally have never used those. I don't really know of a scenario where I would. Then we come to our lasso tools. So we have lasso, polygonal lasso, and magnetic lasso. So the lasso tool is a way to select a general area. It's not very accurate. It relies on you having a steady hand. So you wouldn't really try and select, let's say, the surfer girl with the lasso tool, because you're not going to get a perfect result. But there are scenarios where you might just want to generally select an area to move or to sample colors or things like that. So the lasso tool is just selecting general areas. It's also quite useful for refining a selection. So for example, if I make a selection and I make a mistake like that, I can then take my lasso tool and subtract, and I can go and just lasso that mistake to correct it. The polygonal lasso tool is literally just making a selection with straight lines. So there are scenarios where maybe you're doing architectural selections where you have buildings with straight lines and straight windows, where a straight line selection might work for you. So that's the polygonal lasso tool. And then the magnetic lasso tool is a little bit smarter. What it does is it looks for edges and it tries to stick to those edges. So if I move in a little bit here, and I just click on the edge of the surfboard and then I just move, can you see the way, providing I roughly stay on that edge, it's actually finding that edge. I can click and then I can carry on going around like this. So it's slightly smarter, and obviously I need to go back to the beginning to close it. Slightly smarter than just the normal lasso tool, but it requires an image that's a good candidate for this. So in other words, an image that has very sharp contrasted edges for the selection that you want to make. We then have this, which is new in Photoshop, which is the selection brush tool. And we used to have to go down here to this button here, which is our quick mask mode. But now you can actually just choose the selection brush tool, and you can use your square brackets to change the size of your brush. And then you can actually paint on a selection. Now that might not seem like a big deal, but it actually is, because sometimes you want to get stuck in there manually and make selections with a brush. Excuse me. Now, if you use your brush, selection brush, and you make a closed shape like this, it's going to fill it in, which is also pretty handy. As soon as I switch to another selection tool, that becomes a selection. I go back to the brush, it becomes it's a kind of a ruby opacity that shows you where the selection is. I'm going to deselect that. So those are the lasso tools and the selection brush tool. Then we come to the really smart selection tools, and that's the object selection, quick selection, and magic wand. So I'm going to start with the bottom one, magic wand, which is probably the least useful, but has been around in Photoshop forever. So what the magic wand tool does is it samples the colors that you click on and tries to select similar colors next to that color. So you can set your sample size. It's probably not a good idea to be on point sample, because that just means it samples 1 pixel underneath where you click. So if I choose, let's say 11 by 11, it takes an average of those colors underneath here in an 11 by 11 rectangle and samples those. So if I click now, you can see it samples the color I clicked on, and it goes through the whole image and says, okay, these are colors that match where you clicked based on the settings up here. So you can see my tolerance is set to 19. If I deselect, if I set my tolerance down to 0 and I click, I get a much smaller selection because it's much more fussy. It says, I want exactly that color. If I put my tolerance up too high and I click, it doesn't care, it just selects everything. It says, well, he's not very fussy about the colors, I'm just going to select everything. So you have to find the sweet spot between 0 and 255 that's going to give you the best results. So it requires a bit of experimenting, but it's a good tool to use if you just want to, let's say, for example, I just want to warm up the sky a little bit. I'm going to click, and it's going to select all the colors that match the sky, and then maybe I want to just go in here to hue and saturation, and I just want to push the saturation up a little bit there, and then deselect, and you can see that it's changed the hue and saturation of that selection. I'm going to undo that and deselect. We'll undo and deselect. So that's the Magic Wand tool. It's useful for just roughly selecting large areas of color to do something general to. The Quick Selection tool is incredibly useful and quite smart. It kind of learns as you select, and it becomes better and better as you go. So it's based on a brush, so square brackets to set your brush size right, and then you're just going to paint over what you want to select, and every time you release, it updates the table so that it gets better and better at selecting. Change your brush size as you go. You can see it's doing a pretty good job here. Let's go right in here, and you can go in and then adjust it. So for example, once I've done that, let's go and look here. You can see that in this area under her arm, I need to subtract the selection there. So subtract is Alt, or you have a little subtract button at the top here, and then I can subtract that area. So you still need to go in and check. This is quite a complex selection, so not everything is perfect. So it still requires some work, but the Quick Selection tool is going to be one of the tools that you use the most for good selections. And then I'm going to deselect, and then we have this one here, which is the Object Selection tool. And this one is kind of a more machine learning driven. And so it analyzes the picture, and it's going to guess what you might want to select, and it highlights those in these pink areas. Or what I prefer to do is to target it more by saying, dragging a selection and saying, this is what I want to select. So if I do that, you can see it's actually gone through and it said, okay, I'm pretty sure this is what you want to select. And it does most of the time a really, really good job. In this case, this is a difficult image. I purposefully chose it because it's difficult, but it does a good starting point job. So next, what I want to do is show you that once you've made a selection that's reasonably good, you need to then fine tune it. And you do that by going up here to Select and Mask. You can also go to your Select menu and choose Select and Mask. So Select and Mask, and you can choose to view your selected area on various options on layers, onion skin, marching ants, overlay. I'm going to choose on black because it's going to give me the best result here. And then you can adjust your opacity so you can see the original image. And then you have various settings on the right hand side here and various tools on the left hand side. So the first tool is just a normal quick selection brush. Then we have this refine edge brush, and then we just have the brush tool. So I'm going to use the refine edge, and I'm going to zoom in here, and you can see that some stuff is not done properly here. So I'm just going to set the refine edge brush up, and I'm just going to brush in here a bit. And you can see it tries to find more of the hair. I also, with the opacity, I can also see there's some strands of hair over here. I'm going to try and pick those up. Okay, there we go. And there's also some strands of hair here. Okay, you've got to be careful. So if I've gone too far, I can Alt and drag to deselect. But it's really just persevering and trying to get the best result possible. I'm going to switch to the Quick Selection tool, and now I can see that there's some parts here that are missing. So there's her shorts and the fin, and then Alt to subtract here. There's too much. Okay, not a bad job. And once I'm happy with that, I can go down to the bottom and I can say, let's just fit it in, decontaminate colors, which will remove any color spill from the remainder of the image, and then new layer with layer mask, and OK. You can see now it's actually duplicated the original layer and created a layer mask. If I hold down Alt and click on that, you can see the layer mask. It's done a pretty good job. So I'm going to hide that layer, show the original layer, and then we can do a comparison. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. So there's another way that you can do this, and that is using this AI-driven remove background on your contextual bar at the bottom. So I'm selecting this here, and I'm going to say remove background, and it's actually done a pretty good job. So let's do a comparison here. This is the one that, in fact, let me add a black background so that we can see the difference. So that's the one with remove background. This is the one that I did with the quick selection tool and then select and mask. So the quick selection one is better, but then I spent more time on it. So I could now go with this remove background layer and I could go into select and mask and I could do the same thing and get the same sort of result. All right, so I'm going to delete that background removal one and we'll stick with this one. So take your time. The more time you take with your selections and the more care you take with your selections, the better your work will be. That's just a fact of life in Photoshop. The better your selections, the better your work. So I'm going to delete that background. So now I've got this selection here and I want to put it into an image. So I'm going to open up an image that you can download called Beach. And then I'm going to go back here and I'm going to take this layer that has a layer mask and I'm going to drag it up to this beach image and then hold down Shift and drop it back in here. Shift will just center it on the image here. And now I want to position it. So Control or Command T for transform. And I want to put her feet just at the edge there. So it looks like she's just over the sand horizon there. Okay, that's about right. And then hit enter. So fortunately, I've chosen a picture that has a similar source of light. The sun is coming from the top right-hand side, so the shadows match this image. So that was a lucky break. But what I want to do is I want to add in a shadow that's going to match the other picture, the other parts of the background here. So I'm going to take that layer and duplicate it. So I'll call this Surfer Girl, and then I'm going to duplicate, so Control or Command J, and I'll put that duplicate below, and I'll call this Shadow. And I'm also going to rasterize this so that it's not layer mask. Sometimes layer masks are not going to work for you. It's a good idea to stay with layer masks as long as possible because they're non-destructive, but sometimes you just need to rasterize. So I'm going to right click and say convert to smart object and then right click rasterize layer. So now I've got that as just pixels. I want to now make it into a shadow. So I'm going to Control or Command T to transform. I'm going to set my reference point where her feet are, and then I'm going to just drag holding Shift down. Okay, match that up like that, and then hold Control or Command and match the angle. Okay, let's just, okay, that's about right. All right, so I've got that as a potential shadow. Now I want to load this layer as a selection. So holding Control or Command, I'm going to click on the thumbnail for shadow to load that as a selection. I'm then going to press I for eyedropper, and I'm going to pick up this color of this shadow sand, and I'm going to fill this shadow selection with that color. So I could just go edit, fill, and then choose foreground color, or I can use Option or Alt backspace to fill it. Okay, and deselect, and now let's just change our blending mode to multiply. And what I want to do is also make this a little bit wonky because the sand is kind of convoluted. So with that layer selected, I'm going to go Filter, Liquify, and zoom in a bit here. And I'm going to use the forward warp tool with a smallish brush, and I'm just going to warp this a bit just so that it looks like the shadow is falling over a wavy kind of sandy beach. Okay, and then okay. All right, so that looks better. And then I want to just soften the edge. You can see this shadow's got a slightly softer edge. So I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and okay, I think 4 is probably about right. Okay, so that's just some practice making selections. As I say, it's not by any means an exhaustive look at all selection tools, but it should get you started with using the selection tools here. You also have a select menu. You can explore all of these options here. Some of them are pretty useful, but give this a bash. It's a good starting point to get used to working with selections.